there. Is that right? Yeah. So my motivations to be a science communicator as well as a scientist really are deeply personal as well as professional. I'm a scientist. I value understanding the natural world and communicating it. And being personal about it, I actually grew up in Bethesda, Maryland. My dad was from India. He was a career scientist at the NIH, a Hindu. My mother from Brooklyn, New York, an Orthodox Jew, was a language major. So I kind of grew up with this combination of both science and communication. I grew up in Bethesda. I climbed trees in my backyard. I felt that was a safe place. It was a wonderful place, and it kind of extended into my interest in ecology in college and graduate school, and began studying rainforest ecosystems. This was during the 80s and 90s. I began, of course, publishing my scientific papers, but I also realized the need for rainforest conservation and the need to communicate to the public to get them knowledgeable about the kinds of things I was learning about the forest canopy. I started a nonprofit in 1996, the International Canopy Network. We consulted to the media and so forth. But most of the products that came out of that were really for the environmentally and scientifically aware public, people who would pick up a Atlantic magazine or a National Geographic. And I began sort of stretching my attempts to get to the public to go beyond academia, to go beyond informal science education institutions, and to try to understand how I could link my work, which I felt was so important, to publics who might not walk into the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. I got a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2001 to explore this very topic, and so I began in earnest with that sort of backing, I guess, academic backing. I began exploring that sort of unknown territory, trying to be an ambassador to these other audiences. And I'll just give you a couple of the projects that I've been working on to give you a flavor of it. One of the things that the first project that really got me going was Treetop Barbie. We were sitting around in my lab, we started laughing about Treetop Barbie. We said, well, we could do this, we could inspire young girls to think about Barbie as an adventurer. And so, we went to Mattel thinking that business people might be good colleagues and partners. For some reason, they were not interested in Treetop Barbie. We went ahead and started buying Barbies used from Goodwill stores, dressing her in the clothing that volunteer seamstresses did. But the key in terms of science education was actually making this little pamphlet about canopy plants and animals of the Pacific Northwest. I think it also struck a chord in me because I, as the third daughter of a virtually Indian family, knew the importance of serving as a role model for young girls, especially young brown girls, to know that they could become scientists as well. A second project was involving faith-based groups. And again, maybe because of my own personal mixed background of being a Hindu Jew, you know, we loved curried bagels as we grew up. I started gathering information not from science, but from religious texts and going through the Bible, the Talmud, the Quran, and finding verses about trees and forests in them, and put together a sermon on trees and spirituality, invited myself into places of worship, and began giving sermons, sharing the pulpit then with clergy of many faiths. We have since been doing mapping trees in churchyards in Salt Lake City, where we go and map them, document them in these little booklets that are again given away to congregations. We've begun expanding this and making this more sustainable by working with groups like Interfaith Power and Light, which have a lot of existing connections and networks to places of faith. The third project I'd like to talk about concerns prisons. And for all my life, for whatever reason, I don't know why, I don't have prisoners in my background. I've never committed a felony. I always have felt that prisoners perhaps need the most connection to science and to nature because of their acts and their behavior. They land in a place where they have no access to either. So in 2005, I started a program called the Moss and Prisoners Program. Because of my research with epiphytic mosses that grows on trees, it turns out there's an industry in the Pacific Northwest that harvests mosses from trees and forests for the horticulture trade. This is not sustainable. It takes 2 to 3 decades for these mosses to grow back. So I thought my contribution as a scientist would be to learn how to grow these mosses to reduce harvesting from wildlands. I thought prisoners would be great partners because they have time, they have space, you don't need sharp tools to grow mosses. And I approached a local minimum security prison to enlist the prisoners as partners. It turned out to be a great success. The prisoners loved being engaged with science. The prison administrators found that the behavior was better, there were fewer violent infractions, and I, as a scientist, felt great because I was learning about the biology and horticulture of these wonderful plants. That ended up with my being asked to bring in other scientists to this little prison, so I began bringing my faculty colleagues in. They began giving talks about sustainability, about gardening, horticulture, brown bear ecology, and we ended up with the superintendent of that prison to start some sustainability projects, including beekeeping. They now make beeswax with the bees that are kept in these prisons. It expanded then to 4 prisons, to 12 state prisons. I engaged some conservation biology partners. We began rearing captive rearing, literally, endangered frogs, butterflies, 17 species of prairie plants that are now used for ecological restoration. This has been made more sustainable by engaging the Department of Corrections in the state of Washington, who now actually pay for this project because it's saving them money in terms of sustainability. And we've also engaged the National Science Foundation. We just had a conference last year to engage 11 other states who are interested in doing this. So I think those 3 projects kind of embody what I believe, that one segment of public engagement can involve individual scientists with very little infrastructure, starting small, gaining colleagues and allies and funding, and then moving those projects to a larger and larger range. Again, I think it's important to recognize the personal engagement of the scientist, as well as matching, as well as we can, these links to other diverse publics.
And I want to talk a little bit more about why you do this.
Okay.
But let's get to that in a minute. I mean, you know, again, this sounds like it's almost a full-time job, and it's hard to imagine you having time to do your science.
Right. Well, part of this is that as a young scientist, I really spent most of my time doing my science, of establishing myself as a scientist. And I felt that that's what the value of my institution at that time, the University of California in Santa Barbara. I then had a job for 20 years at the Evergreen State College, which you may know is an alternative public liberal arts school that actually encouraged this. And I was in the situation of a spousal hire. So my husband and I split one position, which allowed me to do sort of half-time teaching and fulfilling the values of that institution, as well as pursuing these. And now as a more senior scientist, I think I have the freedom to pursue some of the things that I think are so important, which is to use that already established sort of academic elan that I have, or cachet, to expand into some of these projects. I want to mention one other motivation, in addition to my own personal passion about trees and connecting to the public, is that I have found many values in terms of the give back of the audiences to whom I reach. That is, what we have learned from the prisoners in terms of raising frogs or more moss horticulture, of providing attraction to the media, people like you, David, who say, wow, a prisoner a scientist in a prison, you know, prisoners working with scientists, you know, suddenly you find yourself on the Playboy honor roll for being one of the 20 most creative college professors. And believe it or not, that does have that is valued by especially
Is that a good thing?
I think it's a good thing in most circles. I think what happens is that using the media, becoming friends with the media, can be something that's very valuable to your higher administrators as well. So I think this sometimes a conflict, what we think of as a conflict, or as Brooke said, the valley of death, can also be more like the mountain of understanding life, that if we can overcome these sort of uphill walks up to the, the summit of academia, we actually get the advantage, the benefit, the feedback that we as scientists who want to understand the world can gain. And I think that's an important message in terms of motivation as well. It's not a one-way street.
Yeah, and by the way, since this is a bit of a workshop, I can tell you as a member of the media that this is great stuff. We love this stuff. I mean, I want to play with these things. The Treetop Barbie, the Insect Fear Festival. I mean, these are wonderful ways to convey science. And in as much as you feel that's important, that is, I do a lot of talks about, why don't you journalists write more about our science? And, you can make it either interesting or extraordinarily boring. And so we've already heard a couple of things this morning, the way to do it. So Daniel?
Yeah, thanks, Dave.